In a small, peaceful suburban neighborhood, life unfolded like it did in most quiet towns. Unhurried and predictable, the streets were lined with neat, single-story homes, each with freshly mowed lawns and white picket fences. The sound of children playing in the distance or a car slowly rolling down the road was all you'd hear on any given afternoon. Neighbors waved as they passed each other, sharing polite smiles, unaware of the darker stories brewing just beneath the surface. John Miller, a 23-year-old pizza delivery driver, was a fixture in this town. He had been working at the local pizzeria for 2 years, making deliveries to families in the neighborhood with a friendly demeanor and a hopeful smile. He wasn't a talker, but he was always respectful, the kind of guy people didn't mind seeing at their door. His job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the tips helped him get by. Most of his deliveries were routine, just another pizza to drop off, a quick exchange, and off he went. That Thursday evening, though, would be different. It was the kind of crisp night that made the streetlights glow a little brighter, the air sharp and cool as winter approached. John received an order from a house at the far end of the cul-de-sac, a house he'd never been to before. It was the kind of home that seemed untouched by time, pristine and elegant. The mailbox was polished, the windows perfectly framed with flowers. On the outside, it appeared to be a family home where everything was in order. But John didn't know what was happening behind the curtains of that picture-perfect house. The order was simple, a large pepperoni pizza with a side of garlic bread. But there was something strange about it. No special requests, no odd details, just an address in a part of town that felt out of his usual delivery route. The instructions were brief, but as he turned the corner to approach the house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He parked in the driveway and grabbed the warm pizza box from the back seat, ready for the usual quick drop-off. When Claire Harris opened the door, John was taken aback. She was tall and striking, with dark cascading hair and a smile that could light up a room. The way she greeted him, polite but with an edge of something he couldn't quite place, left him momentarily speechless. She seemed different from the usual housewives he'd interacted with, someone who carried herself with quiet confidence, but also a hint of loneliness that John could see in her eyes. It wasn't something you could easily put into words, but it was a feeling he had learned to recognize in his time making deliveries. She thanked him for the pizza and gave him a generous tip. As John turned to leave, he felt her eyes on him, lingering a moment too long. It made him feel uncomfortable, though not in a threatening way. More like he was suddenly a part of something he wasn't meant to understand. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He returned to his car, brushed the thought aside, and drove back to the pizzeria. But over the next few weeks, John found himself making more deliveries to the Harris house. Claire ordered frequently, sometimes more than once a week. Each time she greeted him with the same warmth, but there was an increasing intensity in her manner. John began to notice little things. How she would stand a little too close, how her smile would linger just a bit longer, how her compliments seemed more personal than necessary. At first, he wrote it off as nothing more than friendly small talk, but with each new delivery, John started to realize that the attraction wasn't one-sided. Claire's gestures became more overt, and the tension between them became palpable. He couldn't deny it. There was a connection, and it was undeniable. And as much as he tried to keep things professional, a part of him felt drawn to her. A part of him that knew this wasn't a simple customer-client relationship anymore. The lines between what was right and wrong blurred with every interaction. John wasn't sure what Claire was hoping for, but he began to feel like something much bigger than a simple pizza delivery was about to unfold, something that would change everything not just for him, but for her too. But the more he thought about it, the more the feeling of unease grew. What was going on behind that perfect house with the white picket fence? What was she hiding from her seemingly perfect life? John's deliveries to the Harris house became more frequent, each visit leaving him with a lingering sense of unease. Claire's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. At first it was subtle, a lingering smile, an innocent comment about how much she appreciated his punctuality. But with each visit, her attention grew more direct, her manner more flirtatious. There was a new energy in the air when he arrived, an undercurrent of something unspoken but undeniably there. John couldn't tell if she was just lonely or if there was something deeper at play. Whatever it was, he couldn't resist it. One evening, Claire invited him in to share a drink after a late-night delivery. John, unsure at first, agreed. The house was dimly lit, and the soft hum of the television in the background created an intimate atmosphere. Claire poured him a glass of wine, and they sat on the couch, exchanging small talk about the weather, about life in the suburbs, about the things that seemed mundane but, in that moment, felt charged with something more. The conversation turned personal quickly. Claire spoke of her marriage to Mark, her husband, a local police detective. She spoke of him with a certain distance, her words tinged with frustration. Mark had become consumed with his work, she explained. His long hours and dedication to the job had left little room for her or for their children. The loneliness she felt had only deepened with time, and she had grown restless. John, for all his youth and inexperience, could sense her pain. It was a side of Claire he hadn't expected to see, and he felt a deep sympathy for her. But as she spoke, her eyes never left him. There was a new intensity in her gaze, something that made John's heart race. She didn't just want someone to listen to her, she was reaching for something more, something he hadn't been prepared for. And yet, he felt drawn to her in a way that he couldn't explain. When Claire's hand brushed against his as she reached for the wineglass, John's pulse quickened. She didn't pull away, instead, she allowed her fingers to linger on his hand just a moment longer than necessary. The space between them seemed to shrink, and John felt an overwhelming sense of attraction flood through him. He knew it was dangerous, knew that this wasn't just innocent flirting anymore. But the tension in the room was too thick to ignore. A few days later, the temptation became too great. Mark was away on one of his frequent work trips, and Claire was alone in the house. She invited John over under the guise of needing a simple delivery, but they both knew it was anything but that. When John arrived, Claire greeted him with a smile that was different. This time it wasn't just polite, it was eager. She led him inside without hesitation, closing the door behind him as though they were both aware of the gravity of what was about to happen. The conversation was sparse. Words felt unnecessary as Claire took a step closer to him, her eyes dark with desire. The air between them was electric, charged with anticipation, and then, without another word, she kissed him. It was fast, urgent, as if they both knew they couldn't stop once they started. The kiss turned into something more, and soon they were both caught in a whirlwind of passion that neither of them had expected, but both had secretly craved. For John it was a rush, an experience unlike any he had ever known. He had been with women before, but nothing had compared to the intensity of what he felt in Claire's arms. She was beautiful, powerful, and utterly consumed with him in a way that was intoxicating. For Claire, it was a chance to feel alive again, to feel wanted and desired in a way that had been absent from her marriage for far too long. But as the hours passed, the reality of what they had done began to settle in. John knew it was wrong. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen if Mark ever found out, if anyone ever found out. But for that moment, as they lay together, neither of them cared. The consequences were a distant thought, swallowed by the urgency of their need. When John left the house that night, he felt conflicted. There was a part of him that was exhilarated by what had just happened, but another part of him, the part that still believed in right and wrong, was unsettled. He had known it was risky, but he hadn't fully understood just how dangerous it would become. Yet as the days passed, their secret continued, growing stronger, more consuming. They both knew the affair was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Detective Mark Harris was a man who thrived on patterns, on the predictable nature of his work. He had spent years learning to read people, to notice when something was off, when the smallest detail didn't quite fit. His job required him to be observant, meticulous, and above all, aware of his surroundings. And lately something about his home, about Claire, had begun to nag at him, a small feeling that he couldn't shake. At first it was subtle. Claire had always been quiet, but now she seemed more distant, distracted. She didn't smile the way she used to when he came home from a long shift, didn't greet him with the warmth that had once defined their relationship. Instead, she would offer him a strained smile and retreat into the kitchen or her study, avoiding his gaze. Mark chalked it up to stress. His demanding career, the late hours, the pressure. But as the days turned into weeks, his suspicions began to grow. He noticed small things that were out of place, the phone calls that ended abruptly when he walked into the room, the way Claire's expression would freeze when she realized he was watching her. It wasn't just her demeanor that had changed. It was everything. Mark was no stranger to the slow erosion of a marriage. His job had kept him away from home more than he would have liked, and Claire had always seemed understanding, even if a bit lonely at times. But now it felt different. He began to notice the way Claire looked at him, or rather the way she didn't. There were no more lingering glances, no more moments of closeness. It was as if an invisible wall had been built between them, one that Mark couldn't break down. The nagging feeling in his gut grew stronger. Then one evening, as he walked in from a long day at the precinct, he saw something that sent a jolt of suspicion through him. A pizza box on the counter. It was unusual for Claire to order takeout, especially pizza. They had always cooked together, and Mark knew she preferred making meals at home. But tonight there it was, an empty pizza box with the pizzeria's logo clearly visible. At first, Mark thought nothing of it. Maybe it was a busy day for her, maybe she just didn't feel like cooking. But as his eyes drifted over the box, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A note scribbled on the top with a name he didn't recognize. John. Mark's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't know anyone named John, but Claire had never mentioned a John. He paused, his mind racing as he tried to piece things together. He had to know more. It wasn't just the pizza box, it was everything. His instincts, honed by years of working in law enforcement, were telling him that something was wrong. The pieces weren't fitting, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something was slipping through his fingers. The following days brought more unsettling signs. He noticed Claire acting oddly whenever the doorbell rang. Her eyes would flicker nervously, and she would quickly usher John, who Mark now realized was the young pizza delivery boy, out of the house, offering hurried words of thanks before closing the door behind him. The way she would pause before saying his name, almost as if she was afraid of being overheard, made Mark's blood run cold. Mark wasn't a fool. He had seen enough in his line of work to recognize the signs of infidelity. He had spent years observing suspects and learning to read their behavior, and now he was seeing those same patterns in his own home. He knew his wife was hiding something, and worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that this John was at the center of it all. But Mark wasn't one to act rashly. He knew the importance of evidence, proof before confrontation. So he began to watch Claire more closely, paying attention to the small things that slipped under the radar. The little glances she exchanged with John, the nervousness that crept into her voice when she thought Mark wasn't paying attention. It was all adding up. He knew he had to dig deeper, to find out just how far this betrayal went. For the first time in years, Mark felt a cold unease settle in his chest. He was no longer just a detective investigating a case. He was a husband, standing on the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. And yet, with every passing day, the pieces of the puzzle became harder to ignore. Something was going on in his home, and it was far darker than he had ever imagined. The tension in the Harris household had been mounting for weeks, with every passing day making the air between Mark and Claire thicker and more suffocating. Mark's suspicions had reached their peak. He had enough evidence to know that something was happening between Claire and John, the pizza delivery boy. The way she looked at him, the strange timing of their interactions, the phone calls she quickly hung up when he entered the room, all of it added up to one thing: an affair. But Mark wasn't just angry. He was hurt, betrayed in a way he hadn't expected. His professional detachment, the skills he'd honed as a detective, couldn't shield him from the raw pain of knowing his wife had been unfaithful. The more he thought about it, the more he found himself consumed by the idea of confronting her. He was a man who valued control, who prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. But this was different. This was personal. He had worked tirelessly to build a life with Claire, to provide for her, and now all of that seemed to be crumbling around him. As the days went by, the simmering anger inside him began to grow, threatening to boil over. It was on a Friday evening that Mark finally decided he couldn't wait any longer. He knew Claire was expecting a delivery from the pizzeria, and he decided to confront her that night. Mark wasn't the type to shy away from difficult conversations, but this felt different. He wasn't just talking to his wife. He was facing a truth that shattered everything he thought he knew about their marriage. He came home early from work that night, trying to maintain his composure, but his fists clenched involuntarily as he walked through the front door. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of the television in the living room. He could see Claire moving about the kitchen, preparing for the delivery, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Mark stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was it. The moment everything would change. Claire turned as she heard him enter, offering her usual smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was an air of nervousness about her, a subtle shift in her posture that Mark didn't miss. He could see that she knew something was wrong, but she didn't yet know how much he had uncovered. "Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice laced with a touch of surprise. Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, toward the counter, where the pizza box lay open. His eyes narrowed as he looked at it. The familiar pizzeria logo, the remnants of a meal that had been hastily consumed. And then his gaze dropped to the note on the box with John's name scrawled across it. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had hoped to keep the secret just a little longer, but now the truth was on the verge of spilling out. "Who is John?" Mark asked, his voice low and controlled, though there was an edge to it now. Claire swallowed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to compose herself. She knew she couldn't lie her way out of this, but she wasn't ready to face the full consequences of her actions. She had been hoping for some miracle, a way out of this tangled web, but there was no escape, not anymore. It's nothing, Mark," she said, her voice shaky. "Just a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." Mark's eyes hardened. "A mistake? Claire, I've been watching you. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you've been acting. You think I didn't notice? I'm not a fool." The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Mark wasn't interested in hearing more excuses. He had already heard enough. The betrayal was clear, and now the only thing left was to confront it, to force her to face the truth. "I want the truth, Claire. I want to know how long this has been going on." His voice cracked with a mixture of anger and hurt. "How could you do this? To me? To us?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Mark's anger flared, and before he could stop himself, he took a step forward, his hand gripping her arm tightly as the full weight of his rage consumed him. The shock of his touch jolted Claire, but it didn't stop her from pulling away, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, Mark," she whispered, but the words seemed hollow. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." But Mark couldn't hear her. All he could hear was the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears as his mind raced. He had been blindsided, betrayed by the one person he trusted most, and the more he looked at her, at the woman who had once been his everything, the more the anger welled up inside him, clouding all reason. In that moment, Mark lost control. The raw, unbridled emotion surged through him, and before he could stop it, his hands were around her throat. Claire gasped, struggling beneath his grip, but Mark didn't release her. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, but when the rage finally subsided, Mark stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body in front of him. His mind raced to catch up with what he had just done. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Claire was gone, and he was left with the cold, hollow reality of his actions. The house that had once been filled with love and laughter now felt eerily silent as Mark's world crumbled around him. He had lost everything, and there would be no going back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark stood there, his hands trembling as he released his grip from Claire's throat. Her body crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide and vacant, staring up at him with an expression that seemed to ask why. The realization of what he had just done hit him like a freight train. His mind raced, struggling to process the events that had unfolded in such a terrifyingly short amount of time. Mark fell to his knees beside her, his breath ragged, his chest tightening with the crushing weight of guilt and disbelief. He had always prided himself on being in control, always knowing what to do, always being the one who solved problems, who figured things out. But in that moment, he realized that there was no solving this, no coming back from it. He reached out, his hands brushing her cold face, but there was no warmth left. Claire, the woman he had loved and shared his life with, was gone. His mind refused to accept it, his body numb, as if he were detached from the chaos he had caused. Mark's first instinct was to hide it, cover it up. He was a detective after all. He knew the steps, knew how to erase traces, how to manipulate a crime scene. But no amount of training could prepare him for the emotional aftermath. He looked around the room, but it felt like everything was closing in on him, as if the walls themselves were pressing against him. There was no escape. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and staggered toward the kitchen, grabbing the first item he could find, a dish towel, and returned to Claire's side. He wiped his hands mechanically, still in a daze, as if the entire world outside the house didn't exist. He knew what he had to do next, but the reality of it made him sick to his stomach. For a long time, he just stared at her, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and remorse. His thoughts were a jumble, spiraling with 1,000 possibilities of what would happen if anyone found out, if the police came, if they discovered what he had done. But Mark couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to act in the way that he had always been trained to act. His instincts, honed by years in law enforcement, now seemed useless. This wasn't a case he could investigate. This wasn't a crime he could solve. Eventually, he realized that he couldn't stay in the house. He couldn't bear to be surrounded by the evidence of his own brutality. He grabbed his phone and with trembling hands dialed the number he had long since memorized, his old partner from the force, someone he trusted. He knew he needed help, someone who would be able to clean up the mess, someone who could fix what he had broken. But even as he dialed, Mark knew deep down that there was no fixing this. Not really. The hours that followed were a blur. Mark's partner arrived with an efficiency that came from years of working together, quickly taking control of the situation and covering up the murder. They moved Claire's body, wiped down surfaces, removed anything that might link Mark to the crime. It felt like a well-practiced routine, but to Mark it felt like he was floating through it, detached from the very actions he was carrying out. There was no satisfaction in this work, no thrill in being the one to manage the cover-up. He just wanted to make it go away. But even as Mark went through the motions of hiding the truth, he couldn't escape the horror of what he had done. He couldn't wash away the image of Claire's lifeless body from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, every detail of the moment repeating in his head. The guilt gnawed at him, eating away at whatever sense of self-control he had left. The days that followed were filled with tension and anxiety. Mark went back to work, pretending like nothing had happened, though every moment felt like a lie. The police continued their investigation into Claire's death, searching for any leads, but no one suspected Mark. He had played his role too well. He knew how to act, how to manipulate the situation, but deep down, he knew he couldn't outrun the consequences forever. The weight of what he had done pressed on him every second. The affair that had started with a simple delivery had spiraled into something far darker, and now the death of his wife was the price he had to pay for his actions. The truth hung in the air, a ticking time bomb Mark couldn't defuse. The aftermath of that one fateful night was something he could never undo. His life, his career, his very identity had all been shattered in a single, unthinking moment of rage. The pieces of the life he once knew were now scattered beyond repair, and Mark knew that no matter what he did to cover his tracks, the guilt would always be there, following him. Mark's life had become a fragile house of cards, each moment more precarious than the last. The weeks following Claire's death felt like a slow suffocation, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him with each passing day. On the outside, everything seemed normal. He went to work, performed his duties with cold professionalism, and interacted with the people around him as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, Mark was unraveling. The images of Claire's lifeless body haunted him constantly, and every time he saw a flash of blonde hair or heard a laugh that reminded him of her, it was as though he could feel the walls closing in. The investigation into Claire's death continued, though the police had found no solid leads. They believed her death to be a tragic accident, perhaps a fall or an unintentional injury. Mark had played his part well. His calm demeanor, his grief-stricken appearance, all of it convincing. No one suspected him. But Mark wasn't as naive as to believe he could escape unscathed forever. The guilt gnawed at him from within, suffocating any peace he tried to find. He began to drink more heavily, using alcohol to dull the sharp edges of his thoughts. It didn't work, though. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Saw her staring up at him, asking him why. It was the question that plagued him more than any other. Why had he let his rage take over? Why hadn't he walked away? One evening, after another round of drinks, Mark stumbled through the front door of his home, the house now feeling like a prison. It was empty. The place where Claire had once stood, where her warmth had filled the rooms, was now a hollow shell. He collapsed onto the couch, staring at the empty space. And for the first time since the night he killed her, Mark realized that the thing he had feared most had already happened. His life was over. It was a slow burn, the realization that he was beyond redemption. No matter how much he tried to erase it, the truth would always be there, hanging over him. The affair, the murder, the cover-up, everything had led him to this point. He had destroyed the life he once had, and nothing he could do would bring it back. Mark Harris had fallen into his own trap, a prisoner of his own guilt, knowing that no escape would ever be enough to undo what he had done. The end had come, and there was no going back.